Hi, I'm Kelly Day, and today we're going to talk about all things exposure. I know when I first started photography, I shot on auto all the time, and then I decided to really learn about my camera and turn it to manual, and it took me forever to figure it out. I would play with different settings, I would try this, I would try that, I watched all kinds of YouTube videos until finally I figured it out. It finally clicked. And exposure is not some big scary thing. It's actually really easy. It is just simply the lightness and darkness of an image. And that's it. That's not scary. So today, what I want to do is teach you how to set your settings on your camera, understanding why you would set them that way so that you get the exact exposure you're looking for every single time. So let's dive in. If you look into the viewfinder of your camera, or if you shoot in live mode, you can see on the back of your camera LCD screen, you're going to see a light meter. Y'all, I did not know this existed for the longest time, and I shot just playing around, doing different things, trying to figure it out on my own. Had I known this light meter was there, it would have saved me years of heartache. So I'm teaching you, you know now, so there's no excuse. You get to learn it today. All right, so if you look at that light meter, the very center is what your camera thinks is a good or correct exposure, okay? Anything that's to the right-hand side is gonna be overexposed or brighter, and anything on the left-hand side is gonna be darker or underexposed, okay? Let's take a look at what a lighter image or maybe an overexposed image might look like. In this image, you can see that the light meter has a +1 rating, and that just means that it's one stop over what it thinks is a good exposure. And in this one, you know, I usually shoot just a little bit brighter than most people, but this even for me would be a little bit too bright. But if it's right for you, if that's the kind of image that you like, go for it. You're the artist. Don't let anybody else tell you that that's not good. If you like to shoot that way, do it. I say go for it. It's all about you and your vision, and you will bring your clients to you based on what you think is good. Okay, let's look at a darker image. This is one that's one stop under what my camera thinks is a good exposure, and you can see it's a little bit darker. I normally would not shoot this dark, but quite honestly, there's nothing wrong with it. If that's how you like to shoot, go for it. Again, you're the artist, do what you want to do. I'm going to show you here, this is really how I would normally shoot. This image shows, you know, it's a little bit brighter than probably what some people would do. The skin is a little bit lighter in color. But that's just how I shoot. So if you like that, go for it and shoot the way that you want to. Again, you are the artist and you shoot the way that you want to, and what you like, your clients are going to like. I do want to talk about the components that make up an exposure. There's really three things that go together to make up what we call exposure, the lightness and darkness of an image. And those three things are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And some people will refer to this as an exposure triangle because it's those three things that make up what an exposure is in your camera. And I'm going to talk about each one of these individually so you'll really understand. And we're going to start with shutter speed. If you think about shutter speed, I want you to think about it in how much light and how much dark, or how much light is let into your sensor through your camera. And inside your camera, you have these curtains, and a curtain is going to open and then close. And it's the amount of time that that curtain is open is what your shutter speed is. So it's a time measurement. So you may see on your camera like 1/100th, 1/125th, 1/200th, etc. And those are of a second. So 1/125th of a second. That's how long that curtain is actually exposing the sensor to the light. Okay. Now I want you to think about this. The faster that goes, the less light is let in. If you keep it open longer, more light is able to come in, okay? So that's how I want you to think about shutter speed as far as light goes. The longer it's open, the more light that comes in. The shorter amount of time it's open, the less light that comes in. The other thing you need to consider with shutter speed is it's also the determining factor on motion blur. And there's two different ways that you can get motion blur. One of them is from your subject. You know, maybe you're photographing some kids. They run around all the time. I know I did as a kid. My kids do it. Kids are just not going to be still, and we don't want them to. That's how we get the great expressions on their face. So when you have children in the photograph, you may want to shoot at a little bit higher shutter speed because then you can stop the motion as they're moving around and being silly. Also, another thing to consider is maybe you've got some camera shake. Maybe your hand's not as steady as some others. I know mine, I have a little bit of a shaky hand, so I tend to shoot a little bit faster on my shutter speed than probably a lot of photographers do. If you're one that you can't really control your handshake, you can always use a tripod, and that's a way that you can shoot on a lower shutter speed and get more light in without having to worry about camera shake. Okay, so now that we understand that, let's just recap. So the faster the shutter goes, the less amount of light that's let in, and also that's what's going to stop motion. The slower that the shutter is, you're going to let in more light, but your motion blur is going to be there. So those are the two things you need to consider with shutter speed. Okay, let's move to aperture. Aperture is the one that controls depth of field and light. Okay, so the more wide open your aperture is, you're going to let in more light, right? So the opening is bigger, you're going to let more light in. When the opening is smaller, not as much light is going to come into the sensor. So a wide open aperture would be something like f1.2, f1.4, maybe f2. And those are referred to as your focal point, or your focal length, excuse me, your focal length. So some people will refer to it as an f-stop, but it's going to have an F and then a number. So f1.2, f1.4, f2.0, etc. You're going to see those numbers on your camera settings. And just remember, the lower the number is, means the more wide open it is. So that means more light, lower number, more light, lower number. Say that 100 times until it registers in your brain. The bigger the number, the smaller the opening, the less light that's let in. So like an f16, f22, f32, you're not going to get nearly as much light that comes in because the opening is smaller. Okay? I like to think of it kind of like the pupil of your eye. If you were to walk outside in the bright sunshine, your pupil is going to get really, really small. The reason it does that is because it's protecting you from too much light getting in and damaging your eye. Now, if you were to walk into a dark room, your pupil is going to get really big because you need more light in order to see. It's the same thing with this. And your aperture is controlled by your lens. So just because you have a really good camera and maybe you have a lens that doesn't have the range of focal length that maybe some others do, the highest number or the highest wide open that you can go might be 4.5. And so, you know, that's your limit on that lens. So just keep in mind that your f-stop or your f number, your aperture, they're all controlled by the lens that you use. Okay. Now, there's another thing that it does too, and it controls your depth of field. Depth of field just means if I'm taking a photograph, everything from right in front of my lens to the infinity, like wherever my photograph ends, all of that is in consideration in my focal plane. The smaller the f number, the more wide open my aperture is, the more narrow that focal plane is going to be. What that means is, if you look at the chart up at the top, the lower the number, right? So on the right hand side, you'll see that the background is really blurry behind the subject. That just means that the plane of focus is going to be really narrow. The smaller your aperture gets, think of it as like squinching your eyes, right? When you squint, you can see more things clearly. So when you look at that, just know that everything is going to be in focus. So like if I'm at f32, everything from the blade of grass right in front of me to the mountains all the way to the end are all going to be in focus. So again, with aperture, there's a few things to consider. One, the more wide open, smaller number, wide open aperture, more light, shallower depth of field. The smaller it is, you're going to get less light, but more in focus. The deeper your depth of field is going to be. Okay? Awesome. That one's probably the hardest part of it, so just study that one. I think the most confusing part about it is that the more light that comes in, it's a lower number. So just don't let that trick you, and I'm going to show you a chart in a minute that I created that will help you really demystify those numbers. Okay, let's look at ISO. ISO is something that came about back in the film days. It's ISO actually standing for the International Organization of Standards. They're the ones that created it back, you know, when film was available. I don't know if you remember, but you might have seen like Kodak Gold 400 or Fuji 200 or, you know, something 100, and then you had black and white film, you had color film. Well, back in those days, that number represented your ISO, and it's essentially the sensitivity of that film when it's being developed to light. So in the digital world, it still represents the same thing. The higher the ISO number, the more light is let into that image. The lower the number, the less amount of light that's let into that image. And then on the flip side of that, there's another thing to consider. The higher your ISO, you start to introduce grain or noise into your image. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people like a grainier image. Just know that it's not going to look as sharp or as crisp when you introduce more noise or grain. So, play with your camera, figure out where in that ISO range you feel comfortable with the grain amount, and then make that like your stopping point, like don't ever go over it. There are some software tools out there that can help with noise reduction, but I always say get it right in camera and then you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so 2 things to consider again, light and noise. The higher the number, the more light, the more noise. The lower the number, the less light, the less noise. Simple as that. It's not that hard. So the 3 components put together, if you look at them on the chart here, you can see from left to right, it goes darker to lighter, and it shows you exactly each one of the slides that we looked at before. Where you get less light is a higher aperture number, a smaller hole, and you can stop motion with a faster shutter speed, but it's less light, and you're going to have less light with a low ISO number, but you're also going to have no grain. And then just vice versa on the opposite side. You're going to have a wide open apertures, more light. You're going to have a fuzzier background with a more shallow depth of field. On your shutter speed, if you let more light in with a slower shutter, you're going to get some motion blur. And then if you have an ISO that's really high, you may start to introduce some grain into your image. It's that easy. It's really not that hard. Just practice, and I promise you'll get it. Just play with the different settings. Look at the light meter, the one I didn't know existed, and you'll get it. Okay, so onto the chart that I created when I was studying for my certified photography exam. I created this based on my own camera settings. So I just looked at everything that was available in my shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and I made a chart. I suggest that you do the same. Just create it in Excel or Numbers, whatever program you have, or write it on a sheet of paper. It doesn't matter. And that way you know, okay, this is what my camera can do, and with this lens. And anytime you're in a situation that you know you need to adjust either brighter or darker, you know if you go up in the chart, it's going to be brighter. If you go down in the chart, it's going to be darker. It's as simple as that. Now, when I shoot in the studio with natural light, just windows, and I have one subject, my go-to is going to be 1/200th of a second, 2.8, and 640 ISO. That's where I start every single time, just because I know in my studio, the way the light comes in, that's exactly where I need to be. Let's say I'm working with one person, but now the family's here. Usually I'll bring the family in at the end. So now the family's here, there's 4 people, and a 2.8 is not gonna work for a family. So I know I need to move that to at least like a 5.0. And in order to do that, I need to go down 4 stops, right? So I'm gonna go down 1, 2, 3, and 4 to get to my 5.0. By doing that, I am now 4 stops darker than what I was when I started. In order to keep the exposure the same as when I shot just the one person, I need to go up 4 in one of the other 2 categories. Now, I mentioned earlier, I have shaky hands, so going up in the shutter speed is not really a good option for me. So I need to go up in my ISO. So I'm going to take my ISO up 4 stops. I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, and 4 to 3200. And now my exposure is going to be the same as it was on that first shot with the one person. Okay. Now, let's say we're at the end of the shoot, they're getting ready to leave, and mom's like, oh my gosh, I forgot to tell you, my daughter's a dancer, and we really want to get a beautiful shot of her doing a layout, or a toe touch, or a kick, or whatever. Something that has some motion in it. Okay, that's awesome. Great, let's do it. I love those shots. But now I need to change my shutter speed, because now I've introduced some motion into the picture, and I need to make some adjustments. So I need to move it to 1/500th of a second, because that's where you start to stop motion. So anytime you're working with athletes or anybody that's moving around, if you're doing sports outside, 1/500th I would say is the minimum shutter speed for stopping motion. Okay, so I'm going to move my shutter speed down. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now I'm at 1/500th of a second, but I'm also 4 steps darker than I was with that family shot. So I need to make an adjustment somewhere, and the place that I'm going to do it, I don't want to do it in my ISO because it starts to introduce more grain than I'm comfortable with on my particular camera. So I'm going to take my aperture and move it up. So I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now I'm at 2.8, and I know I'm going to get the same exposure that I got on the first shot, the family shot, and now this motion shot. I hope that all makes sense to you. I suggest making a chart just like this of your own camera, your own lens, so that you know exactly what capabilities you have, and even make a line and mark where you want to stop your ISO and not go above that one. This is a great way to learn, and keep it with you. I just would say keep it in your camera bag, and that way you can refer to it anytime you need to. But let's just go back and do a little bit of a recap. Just let's go back and take a look. So when you think about exposure, it's super simple. It is just the lightness and darkness of an image. Okay, so turn it to manual. Don't be scared. Just do it. I promise you will never go back. There are three things that make up your exposure: are your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. All three of those will accommodate lightness and darkness. Okay, so they each go up in light and go down in light, but they each have their own components that you need to consider as well. So you need to think about your shutter speed, everything from being super sharp and stop in motion to blurred motion. You need to think about your aperture and your depth of field. How many people are in the shot? You know, how much do you need to keep in focus in that plane? And then lastly, think about your ISO. How much grain are you willing to incorporate into that image? It's really that simple. I really want you to go home and try it. I want you to take out your camera, play with the settings, do different things, create your own chart so that you have a guide, that you know exactly what your camera is capable of. And I look forward to seeing the results. Share them on social media. Make sure you tag me. I'll take a look at them, and I can't wait to see. Have fun, and we'll talk soon.